Welcome back to another episode of the Scotland series, guys. Except, we're actually still not going to Scotland yet. I promise I didn't mess up. This isn't the Italy or the France series. We'll get there eventually. So last time, you might recall I mentioned a political party in Britain called the Hanoverians. I didn't have enough time to really explain who they were, so we'll cover it here. So the Hanoverians were simply what the supporters of King George II of England were called. For at the same time that George II was King of Britain, he was also the Prince of the German state of Hanover. In fact, Germany was actually George's native land. It is no wonder, then, that he spoke English with such a heavy German accent. But how did a German prince become King of Britain? Well, you will recall the story I told you of how Prince William of Orange stole the throne from his father-in-law, James II. As it happens, William and his Queen Mary had no children. Therefore, it was decided by Parliament that when they passed away, the crown should be given to the next closest relative, who must not be a Catholic. This, of course, excluded James III. So when William died, the scepter passed over James and to his sister instead, Queen Anne. Anne ruled for 5 years, but at the end of that time, she too died without an heir to follow her. The next closest Protestant relative at that point, then, was the German Prince George of Hanover. This because he was a great-grandson of King James I, who had ruled Britain back in the early 1600s. It did not matter to Parliament that George could not even speak English. They only cared that he was Protestant, and so the foreigner was made their king without delay. And this king, at last, had a son, and this son is the George II that appears in our tale. He could speak English, as I said, but the stamp of his German birth was forever marked upon his accent. Thus, Britain was divided between two political parties. The Hanoverians, or Whigs, as they were sometimes called, on the one hand, and the Jacobites on the other. And it was the first party which was more numerous than the second, especially in the country of England. And now we return to the exiled Prince Charles and his patient waiting in Paris. The time was not terribly long. He had arrived at the court of King Louis XV in January of 1744, and by the very next month, the king had outfitted a fleet to invade the shores of Britain. It was not a large fleet, only 14 ships carrying 12,000 troops. It was certainly nothing compared to the great Spanish Armada that had threatened Britain back in 1588. But that did not matter to Charles. Frankly, it would not have mattered much to him if he had been given but one ship and a single battalion of men. At last he could make a move to retake his kingdom. But what was it that changed the mind of the French king so quickly to help the exiled prince? Well, it was not exactly out of any warmth of feeling for Charles. It was actually a move to help France. You see, As is often the case throughout the days of history, Europe was at war. It is all a rather complicated matter, but in short, they were all fighting about who should be the next ruler of Austria. And as Britain happened to be the enemy of the French in this war, it would be most convenient for the French to provide some kind of distraction in their enemy's home country to keep them away from the fight over Austria. That is the way it is with men in most cases. They will only help one another when it is of some benefit to themselves. On the 25th of February, the French fleet launched proudly into the English Channel, with Prince Charles aboard the vessel at their head. The skies were clear and bright. The men were brave and spirited. But the winds turned suddenly against them. Dark clouds gathered in the sky, and at length they found themselves in a terrible gale. So terrible was this sudden storm that 11 of the ships were smashed to pieces, and some of them were plunged entirely beneath the gulping waves. Charles's ship was one of the 3 that somehow escaped this watery fate, and his and the remaining vessels patiently rode out the storm, then regrouped together. But the damage was done. They had lost valuable time. The word of their coming had preceded them, and now all the English coast was up in arms to prevent them from making a landing. Charles was forced to turn back to France. At this point, a lesser man would have given up. But not Charles. His ambitions were too great to be defeated by one little storm. He went back to the French king and patiently waited for a second chance. Louis was not exactly in the mood to spend more money on another fleet. Besides, peace negotiations had just begun between him and George II. It would be most unseemly to be giving aid to the Jacobites just now. For several months, nothing happened. Nothing of note as far as Charles was concerned, anyway. He spent his days wandering the streets of Paris, attending parties and conspiring with friends. His nights were often late and spent drinking expensive wines. If he was going to have a monthly allowance while he stayed here, he might as well enjoy it. But soon, even this royal favor would be taken from him. The peace between France and Britain was fast taking shape, and it was no longer of any benefit to Louis to have the young exile hanging about his courts. Actually, Charles was a sort of embarrassment to him now. He needed to get rid of him. And so it was that one day Charles was informed that he would no longer be receiving his monthly allowance from the royal treasury. If he understood this hint that Louis was giving him, it seems that Charles decided to ignore it. Sure, he could no longer afford to rent the beautiful little house he had been staying in Montmartre, but that didn't mean he was going to leave just yet. Most fortunately, he had a good friend near Paris, the Archbishop of Cambrai, who kindly invited him to stay on his country estate right outside the city. Here he stayed until January of the next year, 1745, when the Duchess of Berwick opened her country house in Soissons to him. At the end of a whole year of living in France, Prince Charles had nothing more to show for it than an enormous debt that he had gathered from spending on servants, fancy clothing, and expensive food. The French king continued to give him hints that he should go home, but still Charles looked the other way. He hung about the court of Paris, meeting with any high official or Jacobite from Britain who would take the time to listen to him. He would not give up on his dream.